HarmonicDyne Zeus Elite is a brand new $379 dynamic driver headphone from HarmonicDyne. We seem to be living in a time as audiophiles where there's lots of great headphones in about this sort of $300 to $500 range. And so these have some tough competition, but their predecessor in the HarmonicDyne Zeus, and I'm not clear yet if these are replacing the Zeus or going to live alongside, but either way there's already some good heritage behind the HarmonicDyne brand. They've made some really nice headphones so far, and so I was excited to hear just how good these might be. Before we jump into the depths of this review, I want to talk about two things really quickly. The first is to say that I've got a sick toddler here at home today, so there might be a bit of background noise in the video. Apologies if that happens. And then the other thing to say is a huge thanks to Linsol for sending out the HarmonicDyne Zeus Elite. Linsol are a sponsor of the channel, but you'll know if you've watched any of my recent reviews of some of their IEMs that they've sent out, that it doesn't mean that I can't say negative things about a product if I think it deserves it. So what you're about to hear is an honest and unbiased review of the Zeus Elites. And with that in mind, let's jump in and introduce them. I've already said these are a $379 headphone. Now there is a slight chance that I might be off a little bit on the pricing. I'm recording this before they're released. I do believe they're $379, but do check for yourself using the links below just in case my information, my preliminary sort of pre-release information was off in any way. Inside the Zeus Elite, we've got a pair of 50mm drivers, that's one per cup of course. And these are a 32 ohm driver with sensitivity of 105 decibels per volt. Now I specify per volt because that is a bit different from decibels per milliwatt sensitivity. And so these are a little bit more difficult to drive than you might expect from the 105 decibel sensitivity, but they're still relatively easy. These will reach 110 decibels of sound output with just 99 milliwatts going in. So what that means is that they're going to run very happily from dongles, smartphones, anything like that, no problems at all. You're going to be able to get normal, safe listening levels with plenty of headroom to spare. Of course, if you've got a full-size desktop unit, they can sound even better because generally the desktop units have better quality sound regardless of power output level. But the good thing is the Zeus Elite will run from pretty much anything. Moving on from the technical design, I'm talking about the physical design. And if you're at all familiar with the Poseidon or the original Zeus, then you'll know this headband well. It's basically the same headband we've seen before, but there are a couple of key changes. In terms of aesthetics, you've got the much darker timber on the Zeus Elite, so you can't tell as much that this section looks different to the rest of the headband. I think it's nicer, it's a bit less contrasty. That's what the Poseidons look like, and it kind of drew attention to the bitsy nature of the design. We've then also got a different set of materials at the top, again a little bit less contrasty. I don't think it looks quite as premium as something like the Poseidon, but at the same time I think it's less drawing attention to itself, and that's a good thing in my opinion. And then the final and probably the most important change is that the padding material on the headband now extends further down the arc of the headband, and it's also covered in this nice kind of soft velour-y fabric. And this results in a more comfortable headphone and I think a slightly better looking headband as well. I mentioned before these little wooden inserts on the headband up here, and that's the same wood that's used in the cups themselves. This is a zebrano wood, I believe. I think in the marketing it might be called zebra wood, but I'm pretty sure that's one and the same, and it's just a question of which term they've used. And so you've got a nice wooden cup, you've got a nice comfortable headband that I think looks a little bit better than the older versions. And then if we turn our sights to the bottom of the cups, you've got a pair of 3.5mm connectors there, so these will run from balanced cables if you want to. I like the fact that these connectors are very slightly angled as well, which is nice. And then if we turn our eyes to the inside of the headphones, you've got these lovely kind of hybrid pads here. We've got velour on the outer edges and the skin-facing edge, and on the inside it's perforated leather or fake leather. The pads themselves are fairly flat, there's not a huge amount of depth in them. I've certainly had no issues with comfort for my sized ears, but if you do have an ear that's more sticking out, you may find that it can touch the inside of the driver. I can't tell that, of course, because I can only test with the ears that I have, but it is worth being aware they're not a hugely deep cup, but they do seem deep enough and with a large enough opening as well. Going underneath the pad now, And underneath the pad, we've got angled drivers, which is often great for things like staging and imaging. And looking on the inside here, and this has not been evident on the marketing that I've had access to pre-release, but just looking at the drivers, what becomes evident is that they're using another of these kind of hybrid driver designs. And what I mean by hybrid driver, it's still just a single dynamic driver, but the actual cone material is a composite approach, where they're using a metallized outer edge and they're using some sort of what looks to be a biocellulose or some sort of organic carbon sort of compound on the inside. And so the dome itself is going to be a softer organic compound, whilst the outer diaphragm edges are going to be a metal-plated plastic of some sort. We've seen this now on the recently reviewed Sivga Luan. We've also seen it on the Meza 109 Pro. So it's becoming a fairly common practice, and generally speaking, I do like the results whenever I've heard it. Of course, driver tuning, how the housing's been arranged, all of that comes into play as well. But the combination of this really rigid, metal-plated outer and slightly more kind of damping and forgiving central dome seems to result in really natural and kind of refined sound quality in general. And so having said all that, let's just cover off one more thing and then we'll jump into the sound section. The other thing that I wanted to cover off was that if you buy yourself a set of the Zeus Elite, what you're getting with it is this lovely carry case. Now, I personally think it's massive overkill and it's unnecessary, but for those that want to keep their headphones away from dust, if you want to move around with them at all, it's excellent protection for the headphones for sure. More importantly though, is the headphone cable or cables that you get with the Zeus Elite. And the reason it's important is because I think they're a lovely cable. They're this beautiful, I'm assuming it's silver-plated copper. Again, I've only had minimal access to marketing materials for these because I've been recording pre-release. But these look to be a really nice silver-plated copper cable, and I say really nice not because I love silver-plated copper, but because they've got this beautiful, chunky kind of woven design that's still nice and supple and very easy to live with. In the box you get XLR and also 4.4mm connections, so you've got both of the balance connectors covered. There is a surprising lack, as far as I can see, of single-ended connections. Hopefully I'm not missing something and there's not an adapter floating around. I don't think I've seen one. But most people these days are probably going to have a device with either a 4.4 or an XLR connector. If you're not one of those people, if maybe you're using tube amps or your dongle that you're using doesn't have anything using a balance connector, then you might need to get yourself an adapter, but they're generally fairly readily available. The nice thing is we're getting a cable that both looks and feels to be high quality and seems to sound good too. I didn't get any sense that it's holding back the headphone in any way. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. The first thing I'd say about the Zeus Elite in terms of its sound is it's what I would call a tastefully V-shaped headphone. It's not really boosted in the bass and really boosted in the treble with a sucked out mid-range, but it's definitely more of a V-shape than a flat sort of neutral response. The treble is crisp and clean from these without ever getting fatiguing, and whilst the mids do come in a little bit secondary to the bass and the treble, as I said before, they're not vastly recessed and the quality of them is excellent. I don't think I'd recommend the Zeus Elite for lovers of vocals because it is a slightly recessed sound through the mids, but at the same time what that's delivering instead is a very dynamic, energetic and enjoyable sound that doesn't lose the mids completely and also doesn't stray too far into getting overly dynamic and therefore fatiguing. The bass from these has a nice sense of punch and presence to it, but it's not at all overdone in my opinion. I think it's really well balanced across the board. And then on top of that, the bass from the Zeus Elite isn't one of those where it's being produced with a mid-bass hump and then no depth. These have both excellent extension all the way down in the bass as well as a nice sense of punch. So it's a really good balance that they've struck with the Zeus Elite, I think. What that translates to is a headphone that overall has very good tonality in my opinion. It's not natural and neutral as such, but it's a well-balanced V-shape, and it lends itself well to all different genres of music. It's good for gaming, watching videos, general YouTube watching, all those sorts of things. It's just a really versatile headphone in my opinion. Moving on then to the technicalities of the headphone, and I'd say it's good. I don't think it's sort of setting any new benchmarks in the price range, but it's definitely solid. I think the treble tuning helps with that sense of articulation, and that brings a bit of extra sense of clarity to them, but I also don't think they're the last word in technicalities. They're good, they're solid, but they're not kind of punching above their weight here. It is worth noting that because they've got a bit more bass, because they're a slightly warmer sound as a result, that is going to mask some detail. So huge fans of detail are going to want to look elsewhere, and we'll talk about that in the comparisons. But at the same time, I don't ever feel like the bass from the Elites gets kind of muddy or thick. It is going to mask some of the micro details a little bit higher up in the frequency response, but it's by no means losing out on detail as a result of the tuning. I describe their soundstage size as again being good, not setting any new benchmarks, but solid for the price. And as seems to be the standard for this kind of price range at the moment, I'd say that the soundstage tends to be more left and right and not so much a lot of depth. I think maybe they're just a little bit better than something like the Sivga Luan, which we'll talk about in a second, but they're not a massively impressive soundstage headphone. Again, they're not bad, they're right probably where they should be for the price, and so all in all, I think the Zeus Elite is a really solid option at that sort of $350 to $400 price point. And so with that statement made, let's have a look at some of the headphones that they're up against in this price point. And the first and the most obvious one, because I've literally just reviewed it myself here on the channel, is the Sivga Luan. This is also a brand new headphone on the market. It's also a dynamic driver using a composite dome. There's a lot of similarities here. And this one comes in at $359 compared to $379 for the Elites. Going back and forth between the two of these, they're a very similar kind of overall presentation of sound in many ways, but with quite different tuning in other ways. As an example, one of the tracks I listened to was Oh Love by Anne Brun. And starting off with the Sivga Luan, the first thing I noticed was the clarity. The sense of detail and articulation of the Luans was lovely on this track. The sibilants in the vocal did have a little bit of sizzle to them, but it was well controlled, it never went too far. The bass, whilst there's not a lot of bass in this track, the bass that was there had a great sense of kind of tactility. You could feel it just a little bit when it was meant to be there. And the separation of the sound, particularly the vocals, was strong. But much like what I just described with the Zeus Elite, it was a fairly left-right soundstage spread. So everything's well separated, but there's not a lot of layering and depth. Moving over then to the Zeus Elite, and the clarity and the articulation were generally quite similar, but in a warmer package overall. I feel like the vocal from the Zeus Elite was a little bit less separated from the sound. It was still very clear, very available to listen to, but not quite as focused and separated as it was with the Luan. The bass from the Zeus Elite has a little bit more body to it than it does from the Luan, but they're otherwise pretty similar. And I think the bass performance from the Zeus Elite is really what sets it apart from the Luan, for better or worse depending on you. Because of the extra bass in the Elites compared to the Luan, it tends to bring the sound together a bit more. That can result in a greater sense of cohesion for the sound, but it can also mean it's less easy to hear individual sounds in the mix because they're brought together by that bass. I'm not going to say one's better or worse, they're just different presentations. I like both headphones equally in many ways. Having said that, I can clearly see that there are going to be two different camps with two different views on these two. Specifically what I mean by that is that those of you that love clarity and detail, you're going to want to go every single time for the Sivga Luan. For those of you that like a slightly warmer, richer sound, but still want good clarity, that's where the Zeus Elite comes into play. And so we're kind of spoiled here. We've got two very enjoyable headphones with slightly different leanings that are going to mean that they work really well. I think most people could pick up either of these and enjoy them. But if you've got a really good sense of the sound that you like, then you can either go for warmth and clarity or just pure clarity and therefore a slight edge in clarity with the Sivga Luan. As for which one I would personally choose, I'd probably go for the Zeus Elite by a very small margin because I like a bit more warmth in my sound, but both are very enjoyable. If you haven't seen my review of the Sivga Luan, it's also worth noting that I think the Luan is one of the most comfortable headphones in the category, and so that does give it a slight edge in terms of comfort if that's an issue for you, but the Elites are good too. I did find myself getting a very, very slight sense of not exactly a hotspot, but I became aware of them on top of my head after extended listening. So they don't quite match the Luans on comfort, but in all other ways, I would lean towards those just ever so slightly for my preferences. And so let's park discussion of the Luan there and move on to another competitor that people might think about when looking at the HarmonicDyne range, and that's the Poseidon. Now the reason I'm going to the Poseidon and not the original Zeus was that I found the Zeus and the Poseidon to be very, very similar, and so I ended up selling the original Zeus because I prefer the Poseidon. The Poseidon comes in at $435. So it's a full $60 odd more than the Zeus Elite. As you can see, in all other ways, they look really, really similar. Driver design's a bit different. I think it's a fully metallic driver, if I remember correctly, in the Poseidon. But in many other ways, these are quite comparable. Just picking these up now, I can feel that they're a much heavier design, for better or worse. They feel a bit more solid in the hand. I can feel the solidity of the metal in the headband, which I don't notice as much. It is still metal headband, but I think in many ways the Poseidon on first grab maybe feels slightly more premium in build, but at the same time is heavier and therefore not quite as comfortable. Beyond the look and feel of them though, I find the sound of these to be quite different. Where the Luan and the Zeus Elite are kind of similar with just a different leaning in them, what you've got between the Poseidon and the Zeus Elite are two completely different headphones that could even be complementary in the same system. I felt like the original Zeus and the Poseidon were very similar. I think you'd only want to own one of them or the other of them. But I think with the Zeus Elite and the Poseidon, they're actually quite complementary in many ways. And what I mean by that is that the Zeus Elite is quite an energetic and dynamic sounding headphone. Because of that V-shaped tuning, it kind of brings all the energy into the music. You've got your treble energy from the cymbals and percussion and things like that. And then you've got the bass energy bringing the rhythm. In the case of the Poseidon, it's a bit more of a mid-range focused tuning, and that can make them a bit smoother, a bit more relaxing to listen to, but without the energy that you get from the Zeus Elite. So some of this comes down to what you prefer if you're looking for one or the other, but it's also why I say I think they're quite complementary in many ways. Listening to a track like We Used to Shine by James Bay, and once again, the vocal is not quite as present and forward in the mix from the Zeus Elite, but the sound is dynamic and punchy and enjoyable. Moving over to the Poseidons, and it's an overall, what I would describe as a flatter sound, dynamically speaking. It's not as in your face with the energy, not that these are in your face and fatiguing or anything like that, but the Poseidon is much more laid back comparatively. Because the Poseidon's focusing more on the vocals, when I went between the two, the first reaction from my brain was that the Poseidon sounded a little bit boxy, but that was more one of those adjustment things. It was the contrast between the two. I don't think either of them are completely natural tunings, but also neither of them's completely wrong either. And so once I adjusted to the sound of the Poseidons, they now came across as a lovely vocal focused and vocal emphasizing sound that's not going too far into that, but gives you a nice sense of emphasis and focus on the vocals. One thing that was very clear was that the Poseidon has nowhere near the bass presence and punch that the Zeus Elite has. So this is where I say, if you want more of a vocal-focused headphone, then there is an option like the Poseidon. I think ideally you just go to a Sennheiser HD600 or 650 or the like. But if you're looking at the HarmonicDyne range, the Poseidon is much more your mid-range focused headphone, whereas the Zeus Elite is more your dynamic, energetic style headphone. What that does mean though is the Zeus Elite is a less relaxing listen. As I said before, it's not fatiguing, but it does show you if a track starts to get a bit splashy, a little bit over the top with cymbal work, then the Zeus Elite's going to show that to you, whereas the Poseidons will protect you a little bit from that. They deliver everything in a pretty smooth and easy listening way, and that's not a way of saying that they're lo-fi, it's just a different presentation that's not as energetic. And so I think here we've got a headphone that is easy to relax with in the Poseidon, and we've got a headphone that's a bit more dynamic and energetic. I think the Zeus Elite is going to suit more genres, whereas I think the Poseidon is more of that kind of vocal type focused headphone. It's not to say the Poseidon can't do other things as well, but I don't think it's quite as good of an all-round tuning as something like the Zeus Elite is. And in terms of technicalities, I didn't feel like one was way ahead of the other in any way. So choose from these based on your budget and or your tastes. I don't think you're going to get a bad headphone either way, but personally, once again, if I was to choose, I actually would go for the Zeus Elite. And so I probably could wrap things up there, but when I was making my notes, I didn't yet have the Sivga Luan on hand, and so one of the other headphones that I reached for was a bass head headphone in the Apos Caspian. The reason I chose that was that I was quite impressed with the bass performance of the Zeus Elite, and I wanted to see how it stacked up as a pure, kind of guilty pleasure bass head headphone. The Apos Caspians are $120 more, coming in at $499. And they are only available, I believe, in America and Canada, unless Apos can ship globally now. I haven't checked that lately. But the Apos Caspian are one of my all-time favourite kind of guilty pleasure bass head headphones. They're undeniably rich, warm and bassy, but have a surprising amount of detail and clarity through the mid-range as well. Listening to Skinny 8 by the Gorillas and starting off with the Zeus Elite, and these were lots of fun on a track like this. The mixing and mastering of this track means the sound is quite left-right and it's quite kind of intimate or in your face, but it was a really good listen on the Elites. The treble was crisp, the bass was punchy, and the vocal was nice and clear. So as I said before, whilst these do have a slightly kind of secondary emphasis, or not an emphasis, but a secondary positioning for the vocals in terms of the overall mix, they don't lose out on the vocals. And so the vocal was really clear, really easy to listen to from the Elites. It just isn't sort of pushed forward in any way. Jumping over to the Caspian then, and the sound really opened up. It actually shocked me that a significantly warmer, richer sounding headphone was able to separate out the sounds more, give me more space between sounds, and generally sound more technically capable than the Zeus Elites could manage. The sound from the Caspian is clearly smoother, with more bass weight and more mid-range weight, and for me the Caspians were clearly the better sounding headphone. Obviously their tuning isn't going to be for everybody, but I think their ability to balance the bass kind of presence, weight and punch, whilst also giving the mid-range a good sense of focus and separation in the mix, and then also not losing out on treble detail, I think that really sets them apart and kind of shows you why they're worth that bit more money. There's some technical capability there that the Zeus Elite can't quite match. It is worth noting that the Caspians can't match the sense of articulation and clarity in the treble because there's significantly more treble energy from the Zeus Elite. But beyond that, I think the Caspians are doing everything better. And so across multiple tracks, different genres, I think both headphones are doing a great job. Keeping in mind the significant price difference, I think both are excellent. The Caspians are always smooth and full but surprisingly detailed, and the Zeus Elite are always dynamic and energetic, but less relaxing and easy to listen to once again. And so I think that kind of brings us to a point where hopefully you've got a good sense of what the Zeus Elite brings you. It's bringing a V-shaped sound that's really well balanced. In other words, it's not overly done. You don't lose the mids even though they're slightly secondary. I think technically they're performing about where they should for their price, and they deliver a fun and enjoyable sound. They're a headphone that I listen to consistently for multiple days after receiving them, and I was never looking to reach for something else. I never felt like I wanted more or wanted something different from them. I don't think they're the best headphone on the planet. I don't think they're beating anything for significantly more money, with the Caspians being a good example. But I do think that if you're looking for a fun and engaging headphone at around about that sort of $350 to $400 mark, then the Zeus Elites are absolutely worth a look. Now clearly they're a very different headphone to something like an HD600 or HD650 that we spoke about before, and I don't have one of those here to compare, but I also think it's worth clarifying they're really not the same sort of headphone anyway. You buy a 600 or a 650 for a more neutral experience, a more vocal-oriented experience, whereas you'd buy these for a dynamic, punchy, and energetic experience. And for that, I think they're doing a great job. So hopefully I've painted a good picture for you. Hopefully you understand now what these are offering, what they're not offering potentially. And if it sounds like a headphone that's of interest to you, then do check out the link down below through to Linsole, where you can pick a pair of these up for yourself. In my mind, they are a good option at the price, and so I will recommend them for anyone looking for the type of sound that I've described them as. And so as always, I hope you found the video useful, helpful and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button, and please also subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.